Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. One of the more interesting things to come from Anthony Joshua's media blitz in recent days after his fight with Darrell Miller was announced for June at Madison Square Garden was the talk of Luis Ortiz. And this is a guy that is not really mentioned a lot by Anthony Joshua, but he says he does want to fight him and potentially next. But just with some of these statements, which I will get to, we'll bring in the context here, I'm just not really sure how realistic it actually is. If there is an Ortiz fight, I don't know if it really can be made this year. And by that stage, is it past the point where it should have been made? So let's get into this and talk about it. Buckle in. Let's go. So Luis Ortiz came out from Anthony Joshua in some of the statements he's made in different interviews, but the Breakfast Club interview is what I'll quote from. So he said, this is Anthony Joshua, "Once I get a big baby out of the way, if Wilder and Fury are still not interested, because they was talking about blacklisting me, they don't want me to be leading the pack as such in terms of negotiations, which is weird to me, because there's enough for everybody to eat. I can look straight direct at Luis Ortiz, because that's the next guy. I feel once I've broken the market in the USA, he's a good fighter to fight." And one of the hosts sort of got straight back into Joshua, sort of saying that he was talking about Miller like he was trash. And Joshua responded, "Big baby's good, but those guys are elite." And he was talking about Luis Ortiz, Deontay Wilder, and Tyson Fury. And I guess that's interesting in itself with Big Baby and Luis Ortiz, where he holds them with how he ranks the fighters in the division. Because the way Eddie Hearn talks, Darrell Miller is a top 5 guy, and he's already said Dillian Whyte is number 4. So if Joshua rates Luis Ortiz as elite, well, Big Baby can't really be in the top 5, can he? But he is, in most people's minds, at least a top 10 guy. But I guess then the question becomes, Luis Ortiz had sort of called out and sort of said, "I'll take any fight with you for almost any money. Let's make this fight." And if Joshua regards him as elite and Big Baby is just good, why didn't he take that fight first? Because it was there potentially if he wanted it. But you can see the strategy. Miller is in the tent. He's in the promotional umbrella through DAZN, through Matchroom, all that sort of stuff. So it was an easy fight to make. It's in Madison Square Garden. Darrell Miller is an introductory fight to the United States. So you can see, there is some merit to having that in the way that it's all come about, because this was a backstop move. They weren't looking to have Anthony Joshua fighting in the United States just yet, but needs must, because Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder, couldn't get a fight done with them, and then Dillian Whyte, who was the backup option to Wilder, the stated backup option where Miller wasn't even really in the conversation, Whyte turned it down as well. So now Darrell Miller is Johnny on the spot. He's got that fight, and Anthony Joshua says he's going to put a beating on and beat him on June 1st in New York. And you can sort of see, this is a decent introductory fight. Maybe not the fight that we wanted, but it's the fight we're getting. But I guess the talk about Luis Ortiz, I look at it and go, is it really realistic? It's a fight that a lot of people have wanted to see, but it's also one of those that I just don't know if it's actually realistic. So Josh was talking about it as the next guy. And what I mean by realistic is, one, you have the promotional considerations, but two, you've got Joshua's considerations with the sanctioning bodies, mandatory challenges. Remember, Joshua has only been fighting twice a year for the last few years, and it looks like it'll only be twice a year in 2019. The first time he'll fight in the ring is June 1st. It's a 9-month gap since his last fight. It's a long time between drinks. He's fighting in the United States next, and then the mandatories are going to be coming to his door pretty quickly. Remember, the IBF, its mandatory challenger, last one, was back in October 2017. And if the WBO is next in the queue, by the time the IBF rolls around, that's a long time between drinks, and I'm sure they want to have Joshua fighting its mandatory at least once a year or at least once every 18 months, because the time it rolls around, it might be well over 2 years. And we don't know what's happening next with the WBO, who the mandatory will be. There is talk that Alexander Usyk could get it. Who knows what will happen, who will be named WBO mandatory. At the moment, Dillian Whyte is the number 1 rated contender, but if he goes the WBC route with an interim title fight with Dominic Breazeale, that's going to all go away, because he'll be a world champion or hold a version of a world title. He won't be ranked by the WBO. But the point I'm really trying to hammer home here is the mandatories will start getting in the way of voluntary challenges. After this Darrell Miller fight, the only sort of scope I can see is if it's a, undisputed fight, something like that. That will be something the sanctioning bodies will get on board with, but another voluntary, I just can't see it. So that's why Josh was sort of saying, I want to look straight at Luis Ortiz if the other guys aren't available. Is it really actually realistic and credible to say those things? Because it may not just be able to happen. And a number of people will already be skeptical of Anthony Joshua and a Luis Ortiz fight just because he could have fought him back in 2017. There was the sort of shuffle with the WBA and IBF mandatories. Joshua and his promoter Eddie Hearn had signalled several months out that they were always going to run the IBF first, followed by the WBA. Luis Ortiz, who was the mandatory at the time, threatened legal action, said he'd take him to court. WBA never really sort of got behind him. Ultimately, Luis Ortiz went off to the WBC and tried to fight Deontay Wilder. But that fight was delayed after Ortiz failed a doping test. Later, it was claimed that, it was blood pressure medication. It just was a paperwork error. A little bit suspect in those circumstances, but, well, it is what it is. The WBC ultimately let him face Deontay Wilder in March 2018, but the WBA banned him, and he's not even still ranked by the WBA since that ban ended. But in respect of Ortiz, if he's not a mandatory challenger, I can't see it. And he's not really in any position in any of the sanctioning bodies to become a mandatory. He is ranked in the IBF, he's ranked in the WBC, very high in the WBC, but there's a logjam in the WBC with Dominic Breazeale. You've got Dillian Whyte above Luis Ortiz. You've got Tyson Fury, a potential rematch with Wilder. So even if it's not Tyson Fury, it's unlikely to be Luis Ortiz next. Never say never, it's boxing, who knows what could happen. Maybe we will get a Luis Ortiz and Deontay Wilder rematch. That is one of the interesting options for Wilder out there. But also, Wilder's been there, done that, got the postcard. But if Joshua is having this voluntary and he can't have any others for at least a year or so, Luis Ortiz probably isn't going to get a shot at Anthony Joshua. But also, there is also a bit of risk now with Luis Ortiz. By the time that fight would happen, he would be 40. And some say he is actually much older than 40. So you have to ask yourself, if Joshua comes in, fights him, will he actually get the credit he would deserve for beating Luis Ortiz, who is one of the better fighters in the division, a guy who is around the top 5 level of the division, but he is an aging fighter, just as others like Alexander Povetkin are. And there is a number of fans who don't want to give Joshua credit for facing some of these older but skilled fighters like a Povetkin. And you could probably see what's going to happen if he did fight Luis Ortiz. Say that fight happens, beats him, knocks him out, and knocks him out in more impressive fashion than Deontay Wilder did back in March 2018. People will say that Luis Ortiz was aged out and that Deontay Wilder wrecked Ortiz, and they won't be willing to give Joshua credit for facing another older fighter. And some are already stringing together the narrative that Joshua targets these guys when they are older and the perceived risk is less. I've seen it from comments from different people who, cite Klitschko, cite Povetkin, and he will have to be careful to some extent of, the optics of facing an older but skilled fighter, someone who is seen to be potentially on the slide. But in respect of the fight, I do like it, but I just don't really know how viable it is. And because Joshua only fights twice a year, and the mandatories are piling up, and he will know this as well, you can kind of ask yourself, is it actually a viable sort of name to throw out? And Luis Ortiz, him and his management have been out there publicly saying a lot of people use his name, but really they have no intention to fight him. And there will be a number of people who will say that this is another one of those sort of circumstances. But I'm just not sure if this fight can ever happen. If it does happen, I like the fight, but I'm just a little concerned with the mandatories piling up, just really how realistic it is. And even if it did happen, would Joshua get the credit he would deserve for facing an older Luis Ortiz? What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.